Hi everyone, welcome to part 3. Okay, Vishy has just played King takes d4. So now Carlson played Rook d8 check, and after King c3 played Rook f3 check, and Anand played King b2. And in the press conference, Carlson said that he felt he did still have some advantage here, despite having played the small inaccuracies that we just looked at. The computers disagree, giving the position as equal here. It's easy to understand Carlson's thinking. He's a pawn up, his pieces are active, he has a bishop against a knight. In theory black should be better, but Anand has played very resourcefully, as always, and managed to slip out of Carlson's grip. He now played Rook e3, attacking the knight, and Vishy answered with Rook c8, attacking the rook. And Carlson kept active with Rook d3. As I mentioned earlier, White's king safety is shot here, and now the position is much more open than it was when the king first became vulnerable, and this gives black some tactical ideas here. Anand is clearly playing to draw, and there are some traps that black has to watch out for, as well as white. So he threw in a check, Rook a8 check, and after King b7, Rook takes e8 is forced because the rook and the knight are attacked. So Rook takes e4, and Anand, must have been happy to get the minor pieces off the board. He knows now that all he has to achieve is the exchanging of the kingside pawns, after which the game is surely drawn. Despite this extra pawn here, it doesn't matter because it's a rook endgame. So next came e7, and Carlson answered Rook g3, keeping an eye on his g-pawn. And after Rook c3, he doesn't want to allow exchanges because this makes Anand's task easier. So Rook e2 check, Rook c2, and now Rook e3, threatening to win b3 with check. And this is an important detail, or white would be able to sack his rook and queen the pawn with Rook b8 check. And this is why Vishy played King a2 here. So Carlson answered g5. If Rook takes b3, Rook b8 check is actually forcing mate on top of queening, especially if King b8 now e8 with queen, and this is mate in 5 or 6. And even if he declines the rook, he still gets mated 16 moves later, according to Fritz. So obviously that's no good. So g5, and now Rook d2 to penetrate to the top 2 ranks. So Carlson answered Rook e5 to double on the e-file and give g5 added protection. As always with Carlson, logical positional play. So Rook d7 check, King c6, and this is forced actually. Despite the reduced material, it's still a sharp position with lots of pitfalls for both sides. If King a6, white is winning. After Rook a6 check, King b5, and now the tactical Rook d5 check. As is often the case, the passed pawn leads to lots of tactical opportunities. In actual fact, this too is forcing mate. King b4 is ridiculous, but it's the best move here. Just dropping the rook. It's just absurd. White should obviously resign. If Rook takes d5, e8 queen, and mate in 8. So King c6 is forced. So Rook e d8, and now Rook g e3, Rook d6 check. As I said, Anand is playing to force off material and draw, and there's nothing more for him to try here. The extra pawn is meaningless. So King b7, Rook 8 d7 check, King a6, Rook d5, Rook e2 check, King a3, and now Rook e6, which is a great move from Carlson. He's just superb at making the game sharp at critical moments. Here Anand had about 90 seconds for 4 moves, and there's a nasty trap if white isn't careful. And this is something that I personally have seen Carlson do several times. He gets his opponent behind on time, and as the time control approaches or their clock gradually gets lower and lower, he'll suddenly set traps, and he'll suddenly make the game critical and complicated, and it's absolute nightmare for his opponents, of course. So Rook e6, as I said, and Anand despite having only 90 seconds left, he avoided the trap with rook d8, again playing to simplify. And the trap, of course, well, not of course actually, it's not that obvious, was rook takes g5. So here comes the crunching move, b5. And white has to give up a rook in order to avoid getting mated. This rook on a 7th is really, really powerful. The threat is b4 check, forces king a4, and then rook a2 is going to be mate. And it's important to note this e6 rook is preventing any meaningful checks, which is an important factor. So the miserable move, rook g4, would be forced now. And after b4 check, rook takes b4 is the only way to avoid mate. A takes b4 check, king takes b4, and now rook takes e7. With an elementary win. So what a blow this would have been to Anand. However, Vishy is of course a superb tactician, and he didn't fall into the trap, although he hadn't seen the strength of rook e6 until it was played. He did confess in the press conference. He hadn't seen the fact that that would save the g-pawn, which is ultimately the result of that move if white doesn't fall into the trap. And it means that, you know, he's going to have to work a little bit harder to win the pawn. So rook e6 is what Carlson has just played, and rook d8 from Vishy, avoiding the trap, as I said. So now g4 from Carlson. So rook g5, and at this point Carlson finally accepted that there was no way to win, and he played rook takes e7. So Vishy threw in a check, rook a8 check, king b7, now rook a g8. The point of this check is to get the king on the same rank as this rook here, to force off material. This pawn can't be saved anyway, and all grandmasters know that the resulting position is a draw despite the extra pawn. Carlson played a4, and after rook takes g4 came a takes b3, and now rook 8 g7, as I said, forcing off a pair of rooks. So king a6, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, king takes b3. And here the players agreed to a draw. So it was a fantastic fight and a great game. Definitely more what the spectators have been looking for. Plenty of combinations and creative ideas going on, the kind of stuff that the world expects during a World Championship match. But due to the pressure involved, something that, you know, doesn't happen as much as everyone would like. Carlson said in the press conference that it was a pity to spoil such a good position, but that it was a great fight nonetheless. He definitely had winning chances in this game, as we saw, but Anand played very resourcefully, and Carlson gave full credit to him in the press conference. And you know, it's great to see that there's no politics going on between the players. They're treating each other with the utmost of respect and courtesy, which is a lot more than can be said, you know, in other World Championship matches. And as far as the chess is concerned, the level of play in this game was extremely high, and with every draw the pressure on both of the players grows. So who is going to be the first to break is very hard to say. Often in tournaments, Carlson starts out slowly and comes into his own in the later rounds. Perhaps we'll see that in the World Championship match too. However, there's also the danger that he'll become frustrated, and this of course has to be avoided. Most of the time he's very level-headed, but after a couple of games so far he has definitely let his feelings come out. And you know, the pressure on him must be absolutely enormous. He knows the whole world is not only watching but also expecting. Anand, for his part, is playing great chess and keeping his composure. He has certainly silenced the die-hard Carlson fans who thought that match was going to be a walkover. In any case, a decisive result either way would be fantastic to see, because it would bring the match to life. Although these draws, you know, are really great, what everyone wants to see is a win. And you know, everyone, well, most people want Carlson to win, and obviously a Carlson victory would set the chess world on fire, but an Anand victory would also be brilliant to see. So, in the morning, Carlson will have the white pieces for the third time, and it will be great to see how he opens and how the game unfolds. With the score currently at 2-2, can the deadlock be broken? We'll see, and I'll cover that game for you tomorrow night. Okay, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed the analysis. Thanks very much.